Can everyone see that?
Yes.
I'll just, yeah, there we go. Well, thanks, Melody, and it's a great honour to be the first presenter today. I feel like the support band, and there's a whole bunch of Led Zeppelins that are going to be coming on later. There's some of my favourite folk horror academics talking. So just before I put the clock on myself, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people and to pay my respects to their ancestors and elders. And I've just got a little content advice that if there are any First Nation attendees here, they're advised that this presentation contains images of and references to an individual who's passed away. All right, so I'm starting my clock now. So in their 1987 study, The Screening of Australia, Susan Darmody and Elizabeth Jacker make the observation that colonial Australia's national stories unify us in defeat. And this idea resonates powerfully with the relentless pessimism of folk horror, where characters are driven along deterministic paths toward their inevitable downfall. And so following that thread, my paper today examines a subset of films from the 1970s Australian New Wave that parallel the contemporaneous first wave of British folk horror. So these films, notably Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw and The Wicker Man, among others, emerged during an early 70s revival of interest in paganism and the occult among Britain's youth. A sort of disillusioned backwards look into the past for alternatives to their failed hippie ideals. And the Australian films in question, Walkabout, Wake in Fright, The Cars That Ate Paris, Picnic at Hanging Rock, and The Last Wave, responded to similar post-counterculture winds of social change, wrestle with our own grim history and its influence on the present, and they also bear many of folk horror's distinguishing marks. So by examining these films through that lens, I'll highlight the idiosyncratic ways that folk horror operates in an Australian context and how its mythic shapes have evolved in a different environment. So while the term folk horror originated in the UK, it isn't, of course, uniquely British. Adam Scovell's 2017 study, Folk Horror, Ours Dreadful and Things Strange, acknowledges its global offshoots, including Australia. And he also developed the folk horror chain, an interlinked narrative schematic of the form's recurring motifs. And I'm sure we're all overly familiar with this, but just to briefly recap, the chain's links are landscape, where elements of a topography adversely affect the social and moral identity of its inhabitants by isolating them, cutting them off from the modern world and arresting their social progress, thereby skewing their belief systems and morality. And the climactic action resulting from these conditions, the happening or summoning, often involves acts of ritual violence or death at the hands of a mob, or the conjuring of destructive supernatural forces. Although I've adopted the chain here as an analytical framework to observe how its links, or if and how its links manifest in Australian film, it wasn't meant as a inflexible constraint around an evolving form. Scovell sees folk horror more as a nuanced mode than a rigid genre, intersecting with other modes like hauntology and psychogeography that share its focus on traumatized notions of time and place. I personally favour folk horror revival founder Andy Patcherick's description of it as an ambiance that can more often be felt intuitively rather than defined logically, sort of insinuating itself into other genres and undermining them. Nicholas Roeg's Walkabout demonstrates this sinuousness. It's an ostensible coming-of-age survival story, but it's also a parable about colonisation's corrosive effects on the human psyche and on the land itself. Landscape is crucial here in terms of how it affects the characters. The fractured, brutalist spaces of urban Sydney trigger a father's suicidal and filicidal breakdown. His two children are left isolated in a rural environment that they at first perceive as an existential threat. And their encounter with a Yolngu boy on his own solitary rite of passage enables the siblings to appreciate the land as he does, sort of mystically primordial and sensuously organic and teeming with wildlife. Their two worlds briefly aligned as the ingrained proprieties that the girl has clung to fall away, but split apart again the moment they reach signs of white settlement. So the skewed belief systems and morality here are modern rather than ancient. The alienation of urban life, the repression of sexual desire, and the industrial scale destruction of nature. The Yolngu boys' ancient culture, conversely, exists in total harmony with the land, but his first glimpse of the horrors of the girl's world and her fixation on returning to it and her ultimate rejection of his culture drive him to suicide, echoing the death of the children's father. So these two sacrificial happenings, which bookend the film, don't occur at the hands of a mob. Instead, they're self-destructive acts of despair in the face of modernity. Walkabout's cultural divisions ultimately prove irreconcilable, and it's only in the film's hauntological coda that the girl experiences an idyllic vision of what might have been, a lost future that she tragically failed to grasp and now no longer seems possible. Ted Kotcheff's Wake in Fright presents a heat-warped perversion of those most sacred Australian myths, mateship, egalitarianism, and the fair go. Its desolate landscape is established in the film's 180-degree opening shot that also serves as a microcosm of the futile circular odyssey of schoolteacher John Grant. The sun-scorched town of Bundinyabba, where he finds himself stranded and broke, is like a landlocked prison escapable only by suicide that drives its inhabitants to primal excess. They fight, fornicate, and drink incessantly, and take revenge on the surrounding bush by killing its fauna for sport. The educated Grant mocks the Bundinyabans as ignorant people who want you to be as ignorant as them, like a brainwashed cult who blindly believe their town is the best in Australia. So isolation in folk horror doesn't necessarily mean physical aloneness. It can also be an individual's pariah status when stranded among a community whose moral beliefs and practices are completely alien to them, as is the case here. But unlike the customarily hostile reception given to folk horror's outsiders, the Bundinyabans' skewed moral beliefs and practices manifest as an aggressive hospitality. Visitors are welcomed with open arms, but charity comes at a price. Grant has to descend to the level of his hosts, because in folk horror, the masses always triumph over the individual, as characterised by Doc Tyden, another educated man who long ago surrendered to the local culture and is now, if anything, the most enthusiastic participant in its degeneracy. Grant's own initiation culminates in a sacrificial happening, a ritualistic kangaroo hunt where he brutally slaughters one of the creatures in order to conform. So beneath his sophisticated pretensions, he discovers he is a Yabba man too. So unlike their British counterparts, protagonists in Australian folk horror tend to survive their ordeals but are forced to confront something abhorrent within themselves that they must then live with. Wake in Fright exemplifies the type of folk horror that originates from human rather than supernatural sources, where it's the folk who provide the horror. It's like the dark shadow of films that celebrate that larrikin ochre spirit, like The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie. And its toxic masculinity resonates through films like The Boys and Snowtown, a subgenre that I've taken to calling bloke horror. So these films were made respectively by a British and a Canadian director. Oops, I missed that one. By a British and a Canadian director casting outsiders' eyes on us, and the others were directed by Sydney-born Peter Weir, and thus offer a homegrown triptych of Australian folk horror. The Cars That Ate Paris' skewed belief system and morality is like an outback mutation of predatory capitalism. The small town's entire economy is based on scavenging from the wrecked cars of passing motorists lured to their doom. The film's prologue, deceptively made to look like a pre-feature commercial complete with product placement, follows two such victims on a drive through a picture postcard Australian landscape. But when their car crashes, the film flips over into horror, upending this idealised consumerist vision to reveal the dark underbelly of the mechanisms that sustain it. Folk horror's tradition of isolated places developing their own stunted morality is inverted here. Instead, as Scavell notes, values imported from elsewhere are distorted as a result of being geographically cut off from their point of origin. And this echoes Darmody and Jacka's assertion that colonial Australia's national identity is a second-hand culture imported across lamentable distances that separate us from the source. Folk horror's isolated communities are also traditionally unified against outsiders, but Paris's social order is instead factionalised and unstable. There's a growing rift between the town's elders, who maintain a facade of Christian respectability, and the feral, car-obsessed youths tasked with orchestrating the accidents, who resent the ruling class for hoarding the best of the spoils. In the film's climactic happening, the worker class rises up against the establishment. The monstrous cars turn on their masters, and capitalism literally eats itself. And this subtextual reading echoes Scavell's observation that colonial concepts often haunt Australian folk horror films rather than being directly addressed by them. Picnic at Hanging Rock demonstrates the power of myth to displace reality. Its fictional tale has largely overwritten in popular consciousness the rock's history as a sacred meeting place for Dja Dja Wurrung, Tang Wurrung and Woiwurrung men until their violent expulsion by colonists. Despite this, as Andy Patcherack notes, a shadow of the dreaming is still cast by the rock over Picnic's narrative. Landscape dominates the film. The inscrutable volcanic formation is charged, like many folk horror locations, with ancient energy, a foreboding presence like a malevolent genius loci. Its eerie magnetism is sufficient to not only stop time, but to disrupt conventional narrative structure itself, mysteriously abducting the ostensible protagonist Miranda and her companions from the film, never to be seen again. So the happening summoning, traditionally folk horror's climactic event, is instead repositioned as the story's catalyst, a seismic narrative shift whose aftershocks reverberate through the rest of the film. The visible horrors are visited on those left behind, haunted and tormented in the aftermath of the disappearances. The community's skewed, repressive Victorian belief systems and morality prove fragile, shattering into mob hysteria and suicides. The fate of the missing girls is left unresolved, open to speculation. Perhaps they'd been punished by uncanny forces for trespassing onto forbidden terrain and disturbing ancient history, a recurring trope in folk horror tales like M.R. James's A Warning to the Curious. Scavell alternately suggests the film subverts this tradition in that the girls seem fortunate to have escaped their strict society through what might be a magical portal. And this reading would make the film an uncommonly optimistic example of the genre. The Last Wave comes closest to Scavell's original definition of folk horror. It adopts First Nations dreaming to generate eerie, uncanny effects. It explores the clash between that folklore and modern colonial systems and invents its own folklore in the fictionalized South American tribe its protagonist descends from. The theft of sacred stones that catalyzes the story parallels another recurring trope in M.R. James's uncanny fiction, most famously Whistle and I'll Come to You, and that's characters unearthing ancient objects that possess the power to call up destructive forces, in this case, freak weather events that culminate in the summoning of an apocalyptic tidal wave. The film is set in metropolitan rather than rural locations, revealing a secretive First Nations culture surviving in the neglected spaces of the colonial society imposed upon it. And beneath Sydney's sewer system, a subterranean cavern filled with ominous arcane rock paintings. Scavell coined the term urban weird to describe this variant of folk horror, which renders familiar cities strange by peeling back the surface layers of the present to expose the hidden histories beneath, sort of psychogeographically re-mythologizing the environment. And this parallels the gradual estrangement of the film's lawyer protagonist from his own culture, as his search for the meaning behind his prophetic visions leads to the revelation that, like the First Nations people, his own ancient mystical heritage has been repressed. The skewed belief systems and morality here revolve around a clash between the white justice system, where men are more important than the law, and the First Nations counter-argument that their LORE law is more important than men. So the film doesn't so much follow the folk horror tradition of ancient ways threatening modern ones. Here it's a case of ancient beliefs being more enlightened and infinitely more powerful. The film's portrayal of First Nations spirituality has been criticised as perpetuating sort of voodoo mystic depictions of the Aboriginal other, but I would argue for it as an earnest attempt to use cinematic devices to vividly represent the dreaming as a parallel reality transcending time and space and physical form. It is true, though, that colonial perspective dominates these films, even when their narratives revolve around First Nations characters. And it wasn't until 1993 that an authentic Indigenous vision of Australian folk horror emerged in Tracy Moffat's The Devil. So in looking for a binding thread running through this first white wave of Australian folk horror, it's myth, if you like, we can return to Darmody and Jacka's observation that colonial Australia's national stories unify us in defeat. The recurring theme of these films is failure, of colonial culture and its interactions with First Nations people, of transplanted social and moral codes that atrophy in an unsuitable environment, and the failure to respect the spirit of the land. Colonial Australia revels in its failures rather than trying to transcend them, as the line from Wake and Fright that provided my paper's title attests: all the little devils are proud of hell. These films can be seen as cautionary folk tales from Australia's flawed past, sort of unflattering portraits of who we were and in many ways still are. And since the identification of folk horror as a narrative form around 2010, the UK has seen its revival in films made with a more conscious awareness of its shapes and effects. Contemporary British horror has emerged amid and reflects a new period of social upheaval where far-right movements weaponize English folklore for nationalistic purposes and when nature itself is under urgent existential threat from those who look at landscape and see only resources to be plundered. With similar forces marauding here, I suggest that the recognition of a uniquely Australian strain of folk horror could encourage its resurgence in our own national cinema, a revival inclusive of First Nations storytellers with their enduring mythic traditions as together we grapple with horrors past, present, and future. Thank you.